The Speaker recognizes Representative Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Request permission to speak to this entire package of legislation.
Please do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I rise to oppose this package of legislation. What this legislation does is it seeks to redefine our firearm laws to take all of the air guns and red riders and pneumatic weapons outside of the definition of firearms. And I think that with a casual observation, this bill looks like it makes a lot of sense, right? These air guns are different than firearms, and we ought to regulate them differently. But unfortunately, there's no part of this package that does regulate these air guns differently. It just simply...
Members, could I have your attention, please? We do have a colleague attempting to address us. The Speaker recognizes Representative Irwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just going to try to take a couple moments to try to explain the Swiss cheese nature of this bill. Maybe it ought to have been referred to the Committee on Agriculture because it's so full of holes. What we've got here is a bill that seeks to redefine air guns and pneumatic weapons as not firearms. And of course, what was not done, the holes in this legislation, is that we didn't do anything to clean up all the problems that this creates. Let me just give you a couple of examples because, once again, I think with a casual observation, we might think that these guns are not the same, these air guns are not the same as firearms and ought to be regulated differently. That's a notion I don't disagree with. But the problems that are created by cutting these weapons out of the definition of firearms are numerous. We reference the word firearm in scads of different statutes here in the state of Michigan, and nothing in this legislation cleans up those holes that we're creating. Let me just give you a couple examples. One, in the state of Michigan, we have something called the felony firearm statute. Felony firearm statute says that if you're a felon, you cannot have a firearm. And if you do, it's a 2-year mandatory minimum. Currently, if a felon has a air gun that has the capacity to kill and do plenty of damage to an individual, that felon would also be similarly prohibited from owning one of these air guns. Now, by defining these air guns as not firearms, a felon could have a weapon that is just as capable as a firearm, but avoid any accountability under the felony firearm statute. Let me give you another example. Now, I'm just going to go with two. If an individual were to commit an armed robbery with an air gun currently, they'd be facing an armed robbery case, an armed robbery charge, but they'd also be facing other charges. They'd be facing firearm violations as well. Well, now what we're setting up with this change in the law is that if an individual commits an armed robbery with an air gun, a gun that looks like a firearm, a gun that has the capacity to kill just like a firearm, that individual is not going to be facing those additional charges and those additional penalties under the firearm statutes. So once again, what we're doing here is we're taking tools away from our local prosecutors to hold violent criminals accountable. Under the current regime, if an individual holds up a 7-Eleven in your neighborhood with an airsoft rifle, that individual is going to face not just an armed robbery charge, they're going to face a raft of charges. And that wide range of charges is going to allow the prosecuting attorney to have a stronger hand in plea bargaining, which could save the public a lot of money and could certainly increase the potential penalties that this individual would face. With this change in the law, this individual is not going to be facing those firearm violations. So once again, we're diminishing accountability for violent criminals, and if we're going to change the rules for these air guns, we have to develop some rules that regulate them appropriately. So thank you for the opportunity, and I hope that my colleagues will join me in objecting to this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Irwin.
The clerk will close the board. The clerk will tally, display, and announce the vote.
Mr. Speaker, on the question of final passage of House Bill 4151, there are 80 aye votes and 29 nay votes.
A majority of members elected and serving having voted therefore, the bill is passed.